always record a DI. This is not an exciting topic to talk about. But wait, hang with me for a few minutes and let me state my case for why this has not only truly exciting possibilities, but it may even save your life. Or the life of your recording. I don't know. It's important. This video is equally geared toward musicians as it is recording and mixing folks, so I'll be bouncing around between these, but just take it as something to consider for your situation and keep it in your back pocket. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is related to reamping, but it's relevant even if that's not something you've done before or are planning to do. What I really want to emphasize with this video is starting to think of recording a DI alongside of miking an amp as standard practice. That being said, let's start out with the reamping side of things. If you're not familiar, reamping is taking a recorded DI signal and playing it back to an amp through a box that changes the impedance so the amp responds like it's getting a signal straight from the instrument's pickups. This has so many practical applications. The obvious one that's implied by the name is to use any amp you can get your hands on, even if you won't have it during recording. So if you know of the perfect amp that you'd love to use and you can rent it or borrow it from a friend, but you won't have it the whole time you'll be in the studio, not a problem. Just record your project with what you have on hand and take a DI, and then reamp it later once you've already got the perfect take put together. This is also true for pedals and effects you don't have on hand, or even the sound of the space you're in. Record your parts in an apartment, and then reamp them in a giant church, or a warehouse, or even a cave. This is a big one. You can use reamping to separate your performance from the sound. This can let you focus on your playing without having to keep mental notes about when to turn certain pedals or amp foot switches on or off at the same time. Or you can manipulate the amount of reverb or the speed of a delay or a tremolo or the cutoff of a filter section by section throughout a song, things that might not even be possible by one person while they're playing at the same time. It can also help a fast-paced session move more smoothly or quickly by getting a sound that is close enough that it feels right for what you're playing, but then just worrying about nailing your parts and then spending time afterward tailoring the sound of that performance to the mix. Imagine you've got a track that was recorded with time-based effects, like a phaser or delay timed with the song. For this case, let's say a tremolo. The performance is great, but they got a little off time at some critical moments in the song. If you make some cuts and nudge things around to fix the timing, well, you also just changed the timing of the tremolo, but only for those pieces. But if you edit the DI and then reamp through the same setup and effects, then you've got the performance you want with none of the timing issues, but maintaining your consistent tremolo. I love a room mic on guitar amps. Even if you don't hear it clearly in the mix, when you take it away, you can really feel the space that it loses. But if you're tracking a band together live in one room, your room mics will be a blend of whatever was going on in the room. So your guitar amps, drums, maybe a bass amp. But if you take DIs, then you can record those room mics and have the sound of everyone playing together. Can be a great, useful sound in a mix depending on the room you're in. And then reamp each guitar afterward and get their own clean room mics without any of the bleed. If you're saying, "Hey buddy," "Hey buddy, I get my tone right at the amp, straight from the source, and you can pry it from my cold dead hands." Well, reamping a DI can also have uses that don't even involve changing to a different setup. God. If you're using a guitar you love, but it's got some noisy pickups, well, reamping can help here too. Hum removal plugins can work pretty well on guitar amp recordings, especially if you've got like a sample of the hum on its own, but I found they work even more transparently removing hum from a DI track, which is generally far less harmonically complex, and then reamping that clean DI through your setup. This won't remove hum that's generated by the amp itself if there is any, but noise removal tends to work best in layers, so reducing what you can before it even hits the amp can work wonders. But what if you're saying, I don't have a reamping box, I don't intend to get one, I don't even care about that? Well, you too can benefit from always recording a DI. Here's a recording of a distorted guitar. Looking at the waveform, if I wanted to move some notes or chords around, it is pretty difficult to see clearly where each note or chord starts. But fortunately, we've got a DI, and with all the transients visible, it makes for a great guide track for editing. I just want to talk for a second about how even if you're confident in your sonic choices and trusting your gut, it can still be a good idea to have an insurance policy. And that's why today's video is sponsored by, if you're like me, you may have over the years taken what I'll obnoxiously call a tonal journey. When I started playing guitar 200 years ago, I started messing with recording at the same time, which naturally evolved into trying to learn to mix those recordings. I was using the newest wave of cheap condenser mics that were flooding the market, and they had a tendency to distort high frequencies. Cymbals and vocals, places you expect high frequencies, you'd almost feel them in your teeth. But I was new, and I didn't understand that this distortion was the reason, or a reason, that things could sound harsh so easily. So without recognizing it, I was equating all high-end with harshness. So the result is that my earlier mixes, as well as my taste for guitar tones and cymbals, were very dark, and I couldn't understand why I was having such a hard time getting good separation between the elements in my mixes, or why my mixes just didn't have the energy of the music I was listening to. I was adamant that so much of the gear I was using had the buzzword of the day, ice pick high end, if it was anything but borderline muddy. So it really wasn't until a major epiphany years later, when I first had experience with microphones that were bright but not harsh, that I realized that I was leaving so much of the frequency spectrum unused. I was never intentionally doing anything up in the high frequencies, and because everything already sounded so dark, it kept me from getting my low-end elements like kick and bass to sound as deep as they could without everything just sounding like mud. So years later now, my perspective is kind of shifting again to focus more on what's going on in the mid-range, now that I feel confident in what I'm looking for when I'm balancing the high-end or low-end. Colt Caparoon has an amazing video on this subject, so I've got that linked here. But my point in saying all of this is that if you're sticking with working on music and trying to grow over time, there will likely be major perspective shifts as you go. Sometimes a track is recorded and it's not released or even mixed until years later. It happens more often than you would think. And when that happens, it can save a project knowing that you have that irreplaceable performance, but with the flexibility to apply a new mindset to it now through reamping or whatever else you want to do with it, since you recorded a DI all that time ago. Whew, we got there. Let's wrap things up here. The reality is, adding a DI to what you're recording is incredibly low overhead. It takes very little equipment or hard drive space or added setup time. So for the amount of creative options and solutions to problems it provides, it's hard to think of many great reasons not to do it as often as you can. Whew, all right. That was a lot of talk. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. You've heard it before, but liking and subscribing really does make a difference, so please consider doing that. Leave a comment, say hey, let me know your thoughts. If you have suggestions for gear demos or studio topics you'd like to see covered in the future, leave them below, and I'll see you next time.